Last thing I made with my own hands for my daughter-in-law was a quilt. I'd started it the previous October, right after the leaves turned. Burgundy and cream fabric, cut into 2-inch squares, each one pressed flat on my kitchen table before I stitched them together. I worked on it every evening after dinner, sometimes until 11 at night, my reading glasses sliding down my nose, the news murmuring low on the television in the other room. I counted the hours once, midway through. Over 40 hours just to that point. I didn't count after that. It felt like the wrong kind of measuring. My son, I'll call him by the name he goes by now, which is not the name I gave him, but that's another story. He married Tiffany 6 years ago. I wore a lilac dress to the wedding. I cried when he said his vows. Real tears, the good kind. Tiffany is not a bad person. I want to be clear about that from the start, because this story could easily sound like it's about a villain, and it isn't. It's about something quieter than that. Something that creeps in so slowly you don't notice it until you're standing in a parking lot in January holding a box of things that used to mean something, wondering how you got there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the quilt. I finished it 3 days before Christmas, folded it myself, tucked a small card inside, just a note that said, "Wishing you warmth this winter, with love." I wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with a red ribbon I'd saved from last year. Nothing fancy. I'm not a fancy woman. I'm a woman who grew up in rural Tennessee, who learned to sew from her mother, who still uses a cast iron skillet that belonged to her grandmother. I don't do things for show. I do them because that's how I was raised. You put your hands to something when you love someone. That's the language I know. Christmas morning, we were all gathered at my son's house. He and Tiffany had bought a place in the suburbs of Nashville 2 years before. 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, a backyard with a deck they keep meaning to stain. I brought my green bean casserole and a pecan pie and the quilt in its brown paper wrapping. I sat it under the tree myself. The morning went fine. Coffee was made. My granddaughter, she just turned 4, was tearing into her gifts with the kind of full-body joy that only a 4-year-old can manage. My son was laughing. Tiffany was in good spirits. I felt, for a while, the way I always hoped to feel at Christmas. Then they got to my gift. Tiffany opened it carefully. She's a careful opener, saves the paper, and shook the quilt loose from its folds. It spilled across her lap, all those burgundy and cream squares, all those hours. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at my son. He did something with his mouth that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a wince. A middle thing. A private language between them that I wasn't meant to see, but did. "Oh," Tiffany said, "you made this." Not a question. Just a statement with a particular kind of weight to it. "I did," I said. "Took me most of the fall." She nodded and folded it back up, set it to the side, picked up the next box. Later, this is the part that stayed with me. Later, when we were in the kitchen and my son was outside with his daughter and it was just Tiffany and me, she said it. She didn't say it mean exactly. She said it in the voice of someone who thinks they're being helpful. "You know," she said, not looking up from the dishes she was rinsing, "you really don't have to go through all that trouble. We'd honestly just rather get a gift card, something from Amazon. It's easier for everyone." I stood there holding a dish towel. "Easier," I repeated. "Yeah, you know." She glanced at me with a little half smile. "We have a pretty specific aesthetic in the house. It's hard to fit handmade stuff in. But we always need things. A gift card's just, it's practical." I said, "I see." And I folded the dish towel and set it on the counter, and I went back into the living room and I sat down next to my granddaughter and I helped her put together a little wooden puzzle, and I did not say another word about it. But something happened inside me in that kitchen. Something shifted. Quietly, the way a fault line moves. You don't feel it on the surface right away, but the ground has changed. I should tell you what the years before that Christmas looked like. When my son and Tiffany first got married, I was over at their apartment helping before the ink was dry on the lease. I painted 2 rooms, refused to let them hire someone. I organized their kitchen. I watched their dog when they went on their honeymoon to Cancun. When they bought the house, I spent 4 weekends helping them move and unpack, running loads to Goodwill, assembling IKEA furniture until my fingers bled from the Allen wrench. I never asked for anything in return. That's not why I helped. But I want you to understand the shape of things because it matters. When my granddaughter was born, I drove 40 minutes each way, 3 days a week for the first year to watch her while Tiffany went back to work. I did not charge them. I did not ask them to cover my gas. I wanted to do it. I love that baby the way you love something you helped call into the world, even if you're one step removed. For my son's birthday one year, Tiffany asked me to contribute to a group gift, a new golf set. She sent me a Venmo request for $200. I paid it. I never heard what he thought of the clubs. Nobody called. For my birthday that same year, they took me to an Applebee's and paid for my meal. I am not a woman who needs grand gestures, but I remember sitting across from my son at that table and thinking, we are not in the same relationship. We are in two different relationships that happen to share a name. I kept helping anyway. That's the part that's hardest for me to explain to people who haven't been in it. It's not stupidity. It's not even pure selflessness. It's something more tangled than that. It's love mixed up with hope. Hope that if you keep showing up, something will eventually turn toward you. That the person you raised will see you. That the daughter-in-law will warm up. That next Christmas will be different. But the quote changed something. Not just what Tiffany said. It was the way she said it. The assurance in her voice. The certainty that what she was saying was reasonable. That my 40-some hours of labor were an inconvenience to be managed. An aesthetic problem. I drove home that Christmas night and I sat in my kitchen and I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and I thought about my mother. My mother made me a quilt when I graduated high school. She made another one when I got married. When I had my son, she drove 6 hours to be there and she brought one for him too. Tiny squares of blue and white. He slept under that quilt until he was 7 years old. He doesn't have it anymore. I don't know what happened to it. I sat at that kitchen table and I thought, this is how it ends. Not with a fight. Not with something you can point to and say, there, that's the moment. It ends with an easier for everyone set over a sink full of dishes. It ends with a quilt folded to the side. And I made a decision, not in anger. Anger had already burned through and settled down by then. I made it the way you make the decision to finally go to the doctor about something that's been bothering you for years. Quietly. With a kind of tired clarity. I was done making things that weren't wanted. The next few months I did less. Not nothing. I'm not cold by nature and I wasn't trying to punish anyone. But I stopped volunteering. I waited to be asked. When Tiffany texted once in February asking if I could watch my granddaughter on a Saturday so they could go to a friend's wedding, I said I had plans. I did have plans. I had plans to sit in my house and read a book and not drive 40 minutes each way. It felt strange, like wearing a shoe on the wrong foot, like going against something so deeply habitual it had become invisible. My son called the following week. We talked for about 8 minutes about nothing in particular. He didn't mention the Saturday. He didn't ask how I was doing in any way that wanted a real answer. Spring came. My granddaughter's birthday was in April. I bought her a gift from an actual store, a set of art supplies she'd been asking for, bright and new in a plastic case. I had it shipped directly to the house. Tiffany texted, so thoughtful, she loved it. No phone call, but a text. And I thought, isn't that something? I had spent 40 hours on a quilt and gotten a flinch. I had spent 11 minutes on an Amazon order and gotten an exclamation point. I want to be honest with you, that comparison stung. Not because I wanted gratitude, or not only because, but because it confirmed something I've been trying not to see for years. The measuring was never the same. The currency was never the same. What I gave from my body and my time and my skill was worth less in their accounting than what I could click and ship. I turned 68 that summer. My son sent me a gift card, $50 to a restaurant chain I'd never been to in a part of town I don't go to. The email arrived at 11:43 p.m. I checked the date. It was not my birthday anymore by 57 minutes. I sat with that for a long time, not performing sadness for myself, just sitting with it, letting it be what it was. In September, I drove to see an attorney. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because the decision I made was private and serious, and I didn't make it lightly, and I'm still not entirely sure it was the right thing. But I need you to understand what led to it. When my husband passed 11 years ago, I inherited the house outright. We paid it off together. 30 years of mortgage payments, every one of them. I also had his life insurance and my own retirement savings from 22 years of working as a bookkeeper for a manufacturing company outside of Clarksville. I'm not wealthy, but I'm not nothing either. I had made a will years ago that left everything to my son. That felt obvious at the time. He was my only child. Of course. But I'd been sitting with the quilt, and the $50 gift card, and the 8-minute phone calls, and the 20 years. The attorney's name was Mr. Hargrove, a quiet man in his 60s, an office full of plants that were clearly thriving, which I took as a good sign. I told him I wanted to revisit my estate documents. He pulled them up and we went through them. I told him I wanted to make some changes. I didn't cut my son out entirely. I won't say exactly what I changed because that's between me and the document, but I redirected a meaningful portion to my granddaughter directly, held in trust until she turns 25, and to two places that had actually mattered to me over the years: my church's food pantry, which I'd volunteered at for a decade, and a small literacy nonprofit in our county that helps adults learn to read. The places that had wanted what I had to give. Mr. Hargrove printed the new documents. I signed them. He witnessed them. I shook his hand and walked out into the September sunshine and stood by my car for a minute, just breathing. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. I felt settled, like something that had been slightly tilted had been made level again. Like I had finally matched my actions to the truth I'd been living for the past year. I drove home and made myself a real dinner, pot roast, which takes all day and fills the whole house with something warm, and I ate at my kitchen table with the television off, just the sound of the neighborhood through the window. I didn't say anything to my son. That's the part people always ask about when I tell this story. Why didn't you tell him? Why didn't you give him a chance? And my answer is, I gave him 20 years of chances. Not chances to change the will. He didn't know about the will. Chances to call. Chances to notice. Chances to say, Mom, I see what you do for us. The kind of chances that don't announce themselves, that are just woven into ordinary time. He didn't take them, not because he's a bad man. I genuinely don't think he's a bad man. I think he's a man who got very comfortable, who assumed the supply was infinite because it had always been there, who confused the river with the rain. Christmas came around again. They invited me to dinner. I went. Of course I went. My granddaughter was going to be there in a red velvet dress with a bow in her hair, and nothing was going to keep me from that. I brought a pecan pie, store-bought, from a bakery in town, $7. I put it on the counter in a white cardboard box. Tiffany said, "Oh, how cute, you got one from Patton's." I said, "I did, I heard they're good." She said, "They are. This is so easy, isn't it? See, this is all you needed to do." And she smiled at me like we had finally reached an agreement we'd been negotiating for years. I smiled back. I went and found my granddaughter and sat on the floor with her, and we played with her new toys, and I read her 2 books and held her in my lap during the cartoon she wanted to watch. She smelled like baby shampoo and maple syrup, and she patted my hand at one point for no reason and said, "Grandma," in the way that means nothing and everything. That was my Christmas gift, not the pie, not the gathering, that hand pat. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and my son was watching football and Tiffany was on her phone, I put on my coat and said my goodbyes. My son walked me to my car. He said, "It was good to see you, Mom." I said, "It was good to see you too." He looked at me for a second, something in my voice maybe, some absence of the usual softness, and he said, "You okay?" And I thought about everything I could say. The quilt, the 40 hours, the gift card that arrived at 11:43 p.m., the will, now signed and filed with Mr. Hargrove's office, the thousand small moments of measuring that had finally added up to something clear. I said, "I'm doing really well, actually." And I meant it. I hugged him, a real hug, the kind I'd always given him, because he is still my son and I still love him. Love doesn't go away. It just reorders itself sometimes, finds its actual shape instead of the shape you'd been forcing it into. I drove home in the dark with the radio on, an old country station that plays songs I know all the words to. I sang along to 3 of them before I got to my exit. When I got home, I made chamomile tea. I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about my mother's quilt and all the hands that had made things with love for people who didn't yet know how to receive them. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who kept showing up, kept stitching, kept driving 40 minutes each way in hope that the next trip would be the one that counted. She wasn't wrong, that woman. She was just working from an old map. The new one is simpler. It says, give where it's received. Love what can be loved. Let go of the ledger, but know your own worth. I'm still learning it. At 68, I'm still learning it. But I'll tell you this. The quilt I didn't make this year is the lightest thing I've ever put down. I keep thinking about that quilt, not with bitterness. That's not what this is. I think about it the way you think about a moment that finally taught you something you'd been circling for years without finding the words for. I gave 40 hours of my life to something I made with my own hands, and what I learned from the way it was received wasn't about ingratitude, exactly. It was about cause and effect, about the quiet logic that runs underneath our choices, whether we're paying attention or not. You cannot keep pouring into a vessel that has a hole in the bottom and be surprised when it stays empty. That's not a failure of love. That's a failure to see clearly, and seeing clearly, having the honesty to look at what's actually in front of you rather than what you wish were there. That takes something. It takes a kind of courage most of us spend years avoiding. What I did at Mr. Hargrove's office wasn't revenge. I want to say that plainly. Revenge is hot and fast and usually leaves you emptier than before. What I did was correct, an imbalance that I had let go on far too long because I had mistaken endurance for virtue. I kept showing up, kept giving, kept absorbing the small dismissals, and I told myself that was goodness, that was love. But goodness that asks nothing of itself is just habit wearing a costume. Real moral integrity, the kind that actually means something, requires you to be honest about what's right, even when that honesty is inconvenient, even when it costs you something. I owed that honesty to myself long before I got there. The harder thing to sit with is why it took so long, and I won't dress it up. I was afraid. Afraid that if I stopped giving unconditionally, I would stop being loved. Afraid that my worth in my son's life was transactional, that I was only as valuable as what I produced. What I didn't understand then and understand now is that letting that fear run my decisions wasn't protecting the relationship. It was hollowing me out. Wisdom isn't just knowing the right thing. It's having enough clarity to see through your own excuses. That's the part that's hard-won. That's the part nobody tells you about. And then there's the staying power of it all. The sheer endurance it takes to arrive at 68 years old, to have outlasted a marriage and a career and grief and loneliness, and still choose to keep going with your eyes open. I didn't walk into that attorney's office broken. I walked in tired, yes, but still upright, still myself. That matters. The ability to absorb what life hands you, including the people you love not showing up the way you needed, and still come home and make pot roast and sing along to the radio and mean it when you say you're doing well. That's not small, that's the whole thing, really. My granddaughter patted my hand at Christmas and said, "Grandma," like it answered a question nobody had asked out loud. She doesn't know about the quilt or the will or any of it. She just knows I show up. That's what I want to be remembered for, in the end. Not for what I gave, for what I kept. My own sense of what I was worth. My own standard for how I deserved to be treated. My own quiet refusal to disappear just because it would have been more convenient for everyone else. The quilt I didn't make this year is the lightest thing I've ever put down, and I'm still carrying everything that matters.